pain, so I'm just going to take some pain medication and don't want to feel it. Usually we investigate, where does the pain come from? What does it mean? Is it a cavity? Is it an abscess? Is my appendix bursting? I mean, we look into it.
Mm-hmm.
That's how we need to see anxiety. There is something that when it's chronic, the mind usually wants to convey to us that there is some unresolved issues, whether it's some traumas from the past, whether it's some strong limiting beliefs, whether we are living in self-sabotaging behaviors. I mean, things that we usually don't think of. You know, the anxiety is kind of this little warning light on the dashboard that says, you're not really clear, or you're not really doing exactly what is good for you. And so when we are addressing that and we are looking more at, where the anxiety stems from and what it actually tries to tell us, then we can resolve those, I call them root causes of anxiety. And then the next step is just to know anxiety will not be something that's gone forever. It's a natural emotion. It's something we will always feel. It's like, you don't lose the ability to be tired when you have a good night's sleep.
Mm-hmm.
You will still get tired, if you don't get enough rest. And that's the same with anxiety. You will still feel anxiety if there are certain things that, are not good for you or get you out of balance or are challenging you in certain ways. And then there are ways for you through, for example, listening to the anxiety-triggering thoughts and counterbalancing them, or being able to change your physiology, your body posture, and feeding that body posture back to your mind as something that signals relaxation or confidence. And there are different ways that we can work consciously to work and speak with your subconscious mind to let go of the anxiety or shift out of the anxiety spiral into a more relaxed state.
There are so many times that people will say, I'm a very anxious person, or they'll identify it.
Right.
Is that key to actually being able to work through a program like some of the programs that you talk about on your website? Is that key that a person identifies the anxiety, or is it not necessary? Could you pick up on it, or could a family member pick up on it and try to persuade somebody, or does it have to come from the person before it can be changed?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think most people know the symptoms as something that, is related to anxiety, whether they cannot sleep, whether they have mind racing, whether they feel like, their life gets smaller and smaller, whether they are feeling they're self-medicating. There are things that may not be exactly labeled, I have anxiety, but the behaviors are pointing to there is an issue. So if there are any behaviors that kind of occupy your mind and also derail your life, you need to look into them. And chances are that they have to do with anxiety, stress, insecurity, and those kind of things. Now, when someone says, I am an anxious person,
mm-hmm.
that's always something really important to immediately get out of a person's mind, because they are much more than that. Because we are not stuck in anxiety. We may have had anxiety for a long time. We may have been in that pattern of self-protection for a long time, but that doesn't mean that we have to end up there for the rest of our life. And many of my clients came exactly with that. I'm an anxious person. I don't know if there's anything I can do. And it turns out they're not anxious, but they're sensitive. And that's a difference. There is a big difference between sensitivity and anxiety. When you're sensitive, you may feel just more, and you may be more aware, and you may also sometimes pick up on other people's emotions. But if you go then into anxiety and self-protection, or if you're learning to deal with whatever you're feeling, that's completely up to you. And often people just don't have the tools in their hands to say, I can actually be in charge of my sensitivity, and maybe I can see it as a power and not something that immediately gets me into this little mouse hole where I want to just hide out.
What kind of tools? Now, I know this is, you could go to your website and start looking at the tools, but for just someone, say myself, I say, I'm looking forward to retirement, kind of, but experiencing some anxiety about it. I won't be a nurse anymore. Like when little things like that, that's a low level, I think, anxiety problem that someone may come to you with saying, I really don't want to put in those retirement papers because I really don't know what's going to happen and I'm really anxious about it. What would be the first tool you would probably help me try to identify that would work for me? Is there like a bag full of tools or a little list of tools? What would you say? Joan, don't be anxious.
This is so good because this is exactly where I would say the anxiety is not wrong. The anxiety is actually there for the reason because I'm not saying you personally, but when people come to me when they are about to retire and they are feeling like more anxious, well, the reason the anxiety is there is that people are losing their identity. That's what they were holding on to. I saw myself. I felt this as well when I put down my stethoscope and my white coat. Of course, I got anxious because that was an identity that I had lived in for so many years. And then all of a sudden, you're not that person anymore, and you wonder, who am I? And that who am I is ultimately what the anxiety is telling you. Who am I without that? And so rather than saying, well, let's get rid of the anxiety, I like for people to find the answer of who am I, which is basically then going into learning to know yourself in a different way, learning to know what's beyond that identity of the career or the job. And often when we do that, then the anxiety disappears automatically. It's almost like, we cannot just fight the anxiety. We need to look more at what is the anxiety trying to message us. And in that case, it's like, am I good enough without my job? Am I good enough when my kids are leaving and, I've been taking care of them and now I don't have anything, no relationship to my husband, no career. Who am I? What's my worthiness? And so rather than just saying, well, here are tools for you to not feel anxious, we need to also say, okay, what are actually the pathways for us to address that deeper issue of your worthiness, your identity, and things like that? Because, I'm a firm believer that anxiety is not necessarily wrong. It's not necessarily false information. We just don't necessarily take the time to look at what the anxiety is trying to tell us.
So we're almost taking the negative tone to it. The word anxiety, if someone says, an anxiety ball or whatever, it seems to have a negative connotation. Yeah. But if you take anxiety and just make it something else, it just is what it is. It's a feeling, or like you said, part of the subconscious. But how does it protect me, though, by staying anxious in this situation this hypothetical one, because I'm not ready to retire really, but or maybe I am and I'm too anxious to identify that. But how is this anxiety protecting me? Is it just keeping me from facing the truth that I'm not going to be an educator anymore? I'm not going to be a nurse anymore? I know exactly what you're saying. It is my identity. Being a nurse is my identity in many ways. But how is the anxiety that I'm experiencing perhaps before retirement, how is that protecting me?
Well, it's protecting you by not wanting to retire because it says that without this identity, you don't really have any worthiness or any standing or any relationship or, we have to see anxiety is something that has been evolutionary with us for hundreds of thousands of years, and belonging to a tribe was a matter of life and death. So if you have a role in the tribe, meaning as a career person, and you lose that role, that brings up anxiety. Who am I without that role? Who am I without that foundation? And so that's how the anxiety tries to protect you, by not letting go of it until you are consciously showing your subconscious mind that there is actually a lot of other things to look forward to. There is a lot of worthiness inside of you and maybe a lot of aspects within you that you haven't even yet explored that are safe and secure and bring a lot of joy. And, there are things you can definitely shift around very quickly. But, often it's also, again, rising or bringing up a deeper question. Why is someone holding on to their career for such a long time? What are they actually avoiding for such? My father was a great example. He didn't want to let go of being a doctor, and so he was certainly someone who was very attached to this, maybe authority or to the approval he got from that. And so, we have to ask ourselves, what is it besides that loss of identity that makes us avoid letting go? Is there something else going on? And so you understand that. Mm-hmm. I think anxiety is just in some ways like an inner compass that, yes, it will say, well, don't do it, let's avoid it. But when you look a little bit deeper and you learn to communicate with your subconscious, then you can also see, well, it's basically just coming from something that you have been carrying with you for a long time. Like, in my case, I had this achiever and overachiever pattern that brought up a lot of anxiety, and it came from a fundamental belief of not being smart enough. And that was seeded when I was about, 14 or 15 years old. And that feeling of not being smart enough was haunting me, and even haunted me subconsciously because I wasn't aware of it, why I needed to have 2 PhDs and why I needed to write books and all this kind of stuff, until I realized, I was outrunning my deep-seated insecurity about my intelligence. And once you resolve it, then there's just a huge weight that lifts, because you don't have to have this, inner slave driver, whipping you every time you do something. No, don't get complacent. You have to further perform and deliver and accomplish. And I was living like this for decades, and being able to let go of this, even though I would have not called myself anxious.
Right.
After it was gone, you realize, there was a lot of anxiety. There was a lot of stress. It's like when we get used to the noise of the refrigerator, and once it's actually off, you feel like, oh, wow, it's so quiet here.
Right, when the power goes off.
That's exactly how you feel. Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. If you had a word of wisdom, but you have many words of wisdom, but what kind of words of wisdom would you like to leave with the listening audience today?
Well, really, don't try to run away from your anxiety, and don't try to ignore it or distract yourself from it. Really see your emotions, not only anxiety, but see your emotions basically as your inner guidance system. Your emotions have an intelligence in themselves. Your subconscious has a wisdom in itself. And sometimes we just need to step away from trying to be in control or having to know everything intellectually and calling our emotions as, well, this doesn't really make sense, and just stop and pay attention to whatever, messages these emotions may bring forth, and then address them. And that's where I believe real healing happens, when we are not, same thing with the physical body, I'm sure you agree, real healing is not getting rid of illness, it's coming back to your wholeness. And that's the same thing with emotions. It's not about getting rid of emotions. It's about more coming back to a state of balance and harmony within, which most of us are not really living in. And I think that's the opportunity that the anxiety is, in some ways, faithfully providing us with by knocking at our doors and saying, okay, pay attention. Somehow you're not really living exactly the ways that is good for you.
Well, we want to thank our guest, Dr. Friedemann Schwab, for talking about fear and anxiety, particularly his book, The Fear and Anxiety Solution. And we want to thank you for listening to Your Family's Health.
This brings an end to another edition of Your Family's Health on 90.3 FM, the voice of Nassau Community College. Joan Buckley is professor of nursing at Nassau Community College. Your comments are always welcome at whpc@ncc.edu. This program was produced at the studios of WHPC 90.3 on the campus of Nassau Community College. Join us again next week for another edition of Your Family's Health.